Sometimes this world makes no sense to me. I'm torn between what others want and what is me. It seems a song is what the world demands, but how can I sing in this strange land? Until I die, I will sing God's song, living in this Babylon. Always looking for the shore of the world that I was made for. The world where the weak are finally strong and the righteous are known for righting wrongs. I want to see this earth start shaking, being impacted by a powerful generation that is finally waking up inside. And on the final day, when I die, I want to hold my head up high. I want to look God himself in the eye and see his face full of pride.
Well, we have been in a series going through the book of Daniel. We're into our third week here, and very excited about the series, Daniel, When Cultures Collide. And I don't know about you, but as I've been studying this passage and the whole book of Daniel over the last many months, one of the things that has stood out to me, and somebody actually mentioned this, that they recognized it last week, is that one thing that stood out was the fact that Daniel, when he was taken into exile, he was 15 years old, probably right around that age of 15, which means as he was going through that 3-year period of being trained up in Babylon to be a Babylonian, he was somewhere between the ages of 15 and 18. Now, I want you to think about this for just a second. Do you remember what it was like to be a 15-year-old? Maybe some of you in the room are right around that age, and so you're like, yep, totally get it. But can you adults remember what it was like? I want you to do this for just a minute. Now, I'm taking a gamble here. I'm going to ask you to talk with somebody next to you. And when you do this, don't talk about the OSU or Michigan football games yesterday, okay? I'm watching. I'm waiting. But I want you to turn to somebody and answer this question. What were your biggest worries at the age of 15? Talk about that. What things worried you the most at the age of 15? Don't start talking about that football game. So I want you to think about this with me for just a second. As I was thinking about it this week, I've got a son, Garrett, who is 14 years old, 1 year away from 15. And what has been plaguing my mind has been, what would it be like if Garrett had been Daniel? A young boy, a raiding army comes into your city, overthrows it, and drags you away from your family and everything that you know, and marches you off to a land that is completely unfamiliar. You've never been on your own before, and you're stuck. You know, when I think about when I was 15 years old, or when I think about Garrett and the age that he's at, maybe you shared some of these same things. I think sometimes the biggest worries we have is, what are they going to provide for snack at school? What is the hot lunch going to be? Did I get my homework done, and will my dad yell at me if I didn't do it? Can I get away with a later bedtime or curfew? You know, how many drinks of water can I get before I really get in trouble? Maybe the worries that you have as a young person is what maybe that boy or girl may think of you, or how late can I sleep in before my parents really get upset with me because I got to get to school on time, or how late will they let me sleep in on Saturday before they ask me to get up and do chores, right? I mean, for many people at the age of 15, a lot of the things that we have to worry about aren't that big. Now, that doesn't mean that at age 15, some of us didn't have really difficult things we had to deal with. I recognize that happens. But on average, when we're young and at the age of 15, most things are taken care of for us. We are completely provided for, and our worries don't seem too big. And yet Daniel, at this ripe age of 15, has to deal with being dragged away. into a land that he doesn't know, unsure of what is going to happen or even if he will be killed. But you know what I find super impressive about Daniel? What I love as I read through this passage and through this book is that Daniel, in the midst of this, as a young man, a very young man, remains incredibly faithful to God through it all, wholly devoted. If you have your Bibles, turn with me to Daniel chapter 2. Pull out your sermon notes and follow along. Letter B under Roman numeral number 1. Not only was Daniel exiled to Babylon at the age of 15 years old, but secondly, Daniel remained faithful to God, and the Bible tells us that he found favor because of it. He found favor with God, but he also found favor within the Babylonian kingdom and even with King Nebuchadnezzar. You remember that Daniel, as he was taken off into this land, marched all the way there. He gets there, and Nebuchadnezzar begins a process of trying to brainwash and strip the identity from the Jews that he had exiled from the land, the nobility, the royalty, the important, smart people. And his desire was to take them and to turn them into Babylonians, to strip them from them every vestige of who they were prior to this point. And so it tells us in chapter 1 that he goes and he teaches them the language, he teaches them the literature, he changes their names to try to give them a completely new identity. He also goes and rather than giving them things that they might have eaten in their land, provides them with what is called the king's food. And what I found really incredible about this is that Daniel looks back at this food, as we talked about last week, where he could have said, this really doesn't matter. Everybody around me is eating the king's food. I might as well do it too. I'm tired, I'm hungry, I'm worried. He could have just given in. But what we understand is that Daniel believed that it was important for him to continue to remain faithful to God and to be holy and set apart, as was written in the Mosaic Law. And because of that, he remembered and he knew what the Mosaic Law said about what you could eat, and so he decided to keep himself holy. What's so incredible about this faithfulness, though, is that Daniel, in making this decision and even asking for the right and privilege to not eat the king's food, but to just simply live off these vegetables and water, is he could have been killed for even asking, and yet he boldly does what he knows God wants him to do. And the passage tells us because of that, he finds favor with Nebuchadnezzar ultimately, and he also finds favor within the kingdom because God had shown him favor. What we learn about Daniel in this first chapter is that Daniel begins to learn these truths in a very real way. That while God had sent his people into exile because of their disobedience and refusal to remain faithful to him, God had not abandoned them as a people, and God had not abandoned Daniel. Daniel knew that God was still in control, and he had the power over even this impossible situation that Daniel faced. I want you to remember what we talked about the last 2 weeks, one of the themes that will run through this entire series, and it's this theme: what you believe to be true about God will absolutely impact the way that you worship him. We see this in Daniel's life time and time again. Last week we saw it when Daniel kept himself holy and set apart. He believed that God was holy and he desired holiness from his people. And so because Daniel saw himself as a follower of God, he decided to remain holy no matter what it would cost, because he decided that he wanted to worship God in every single way. But this week, as we look into the scripture and the impossible situation that Daniel has faced and will continue to face, we are going to see that Daniel worships God in everything that he does because of what he believes to be true about God, especially in the area of the fact that God is in control of all things. God himself has power over the impossible. You see, just when Daniel felt like things might actually be moving in the right direction and starting to get better, he's gone through this 3-year period of time where he is being tested, where he is learning this whole new way of life. Nebuchadnezzar looks at him and says, "All right, you're good." What happens next? Letter C, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And it seems as though the impossible starts to happen again and everything starts to fall apart. Take a look with me, if you will, at Daniel chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, reading through verse 13. Daniel chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. It says, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. And so they came in and they stood before the king. And the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. And so the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show you the interpretation. And the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the word from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be laid in ruins. But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and its interpretation. And they answered him a second time and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show its interpretation. But the king said, I know with certainty that you are trying to gain time, because you see that the word from me is firm. If you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence for you. You have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the times change. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me its interpretation. Verse 10, the Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demands, or no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. And because of this, the king was angry and very furious, and he commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Can you imagine what this must have been like in this moment for Daniel, where it seems like, okay, God has shown his favor, he has received favor with Nebuchadnezzar. Now Nebuchadnezzar has this dream that worries him, and he calls together all of the enchanters and magicians and sorcerers, it says the Chaldeans, and asks them what this is, and not only what does the dream mean, but he wants them to tell him exactly what the dream was without himself telling them. And if they can't do it, then they'll be killed. And Daniel finds himself at the end of this little exchange being one of those that is targeted for death. I want you to understand something as we kind of unpack this part of the passage. Number one, dreams had significant meaning in Babylonian religious culture. Now, let me ask this question. Have you ever had a dream that seemed so real that you believed that it was true? Anybody here ever had that experience? Come on, I know there's more of you out there. Think about it. Maybe you had a dream that, you came into some great riches and you could buy all this wonderful stuff and you had this wonderful posh life, and then you woke up and were severely depressed, right? Or maybe, how many of you have had the dream where you feel like you're falling? Anybody ever had that dream, right? That is the worst feeling in the world. How about this? I had this dream a couple times when I was in high school. I remember that the dream went like this. I would wake up in the morning, I would be getting ready for school, going through my normal rigmarole. My mom would tell me that it was time to go, and so we'd go out and get in the car, and she would drive us to school. Usually it was like this really cold morning, at least California cold. It was like 60. But there were, I know, right? Hey, I'm not as soft as I used to be. Okay, so it was cold, and there was tons of fog. And I remember that vividly. Was even in this dream that my mom was driving us through the crazy fog that we often had to drive through to get to school early in the morning. And then I get to school, and it was like the normal day and routine. You're just walking around, seeing your friends, saying hi. And then after a few moments, you notice they're kind of looking at you funny. You know where this is going, right? They're looking at you weird, and then they're kind of looking down and going, right? Well, look at him. And then I look down in this dream, and I have no pants. I am actually naked, standing there with my friends, thinking in this dream, how does this happen? And everywhere that I run, there's somebody at every single corner, everywhere I turn to try to hide. Anybody here ever had that dream before, the naked at school dream? Okay, there's a few honest people in the room, right? We don't like that because it's embarrassing, but let me tell you something. Whenever I had that dream, I never woke up from that thinking to myself, what does it mean? Right? What usually happened is I would wake up with beads of sweat all over my face in a permanent state of worship saying, thank you, God, that was not real, because it seemed so real in the moment, right? In our culture today, dreams are what? Dreams don't have meaning. We think of dreams as just our brains on overdrive because of our busy lives and schedules, or maybe we ate something weird before we went to bed, and so we have these weird dreams. They don't really mean anything. But in Babylonian culture, that was completely different. Dreams in Babylonian culture were thought to be messages from the gods. You see, when he calls the magicians and the enchanters, the sorcerers, and it says the Chaldeans, which when you see Chaldeans, you should put in parentheses there, or you should write it down, meaning astrologers. When he pulls these people together, essentially these were the religious priests of Babylonian culture. And they were supposed to be the people that were most connected to the gods that they worshiped. And when he tells them, I want you to tell me the dream, not just the interpretation, but I want you to tell me what I dreamed, he's putting them to the test because he wants to see if they are legit. If they are really as connected to the gods as they say they are, then they should be able to know what it was that he dreamed the night before and then interpret it to him. And the reason he does this is because Nebuchadnezzar, when you look and you find out a lot about this guy was like most ancient kings in that he was fearful of losing his kingdom, and he would constantly put people to test because he feared those who might be out to get him. He wanted to make sure that they were really the beholders of wisdom that they claimed to be. And if they could not do it, he would put them to death if they proved to not be connected to the gods in the way that they claimed. Number two, not only were the dreams have significant meaning in Babylonian religious culture, but Nebuchadnezzar's response to them was a testament to his ruthless character as a king. History describes Nebuchadnezzar as a brutal king, a powerful and an ambitious king. He was known in rabbinic literature as the wicked one and was known for his incredible cruelty. One of the things that is written in non-biblical sources is that the exiles that he took from Jerusalem and dragged all the way to Babylon, that he forced them to walk the entire way without stopping to rest even once because of his fear that they would pray to their gods and that their gods would answer and somehow they would be able to overthrow his army. It also says that he brutally killed people. And we see this picture where it says here that he tells these religious priests of his nation that he will have them torn limb from limb. Now, some versions will say cut to pieces, but the word cut is not actually in the Hebrew text. It actually is this idea of being torn limb from limb. One of the ways that they would do that during that day in Babylon is they would find 4 really strong trees, tie ropes to the top of them, pull them down and in, tie the ropes to the limbs of a person, and then cut a rope and let them fly and pull the person apart. That was how brutal this king was. And if we need more of a picture, we see in chapter 3, which we'll look at next week, that he throws people into fiery furnace. We see that in that culture later on down the road, that Daniel himself is thrown into a lion's den. His character was known for being one who was brutal. And like many rulers of the ancient days, he lived in constant fear of losing his kingdom, and so he brutally murdered anyone who could possibly be a threat to him. And so here we find letter D. Daniel finds himself on the short end of a death warrant. Daniel himself, having been proclaimed as one who was incredibly wise and who could interpret dreams, he and his friends are now on the list of people to be killed if the king's dream cannot be told and cannot be interpreted. Can you imagine what that must have been like for Daniel? He had very, very few options in that moment. He was faced with an impossible situation and had very few options. Letter A under number 2, Daniel could have given up. One of those options was that he could have given up and figured that he had been abandoned by God and just gone to his death. It would have been very easy for him in that moment to just say, this situation's impossible. There's nothing I can do. And just, where is God in the middle of this? I thought he was with me and now I'm going to be killed. And he could have given up. What I find is interesting is that often, even in our own culture today as Christians, that often our response seems to be very similar when we face impossible situations. That oftentimes it's very easy for us when something seems overwhelming or it saps us of our hope or our joy. It's at times far easier to give up and to figure that God is not with us. Many people will say, if God loved me, if God was truly with me, then he wouldn't allow these bad things to happen in my life. He would answer me when I ask him to take those things away. I mean, think about it. What are the impossible situations that you're facing? What are the situations in your life where you feel like you are being robbed of your joy and your hope? Where you feel like there is no answer for the issue that you face? Some people deal with issues like the senseless death of a loved one, or broken marriages or relationships, a diagnosis of a sickness that could end in death, the prolonged loss of jobs or financial difficulties. Some people battle with depression or mental illness that never seems to have a light at the end of the tunnel. Whatever it is that's going on in your life, these things will often turn our lives upside down and rob us of our joy and rob us of our hope if we let them. Can you see how this could be true for Daniel in this moment? How easy would it be to just give up and say, well, God obviously isn't with me? Another way that he could have responded, letter B, is that Daniel could have tried to take matters into his own hands by fighting back or trying to run. I don't know. I probably would have found myself in that situation of thinking, how can I run and hide and get out of here? For Daniel, it probably would have been very difficult. Nebuchadnezzar's army would have probably very easily found him and put him to death, but there's no doubt that there would be this temptation to take matter into his own hands, something that we often do ourselves when impossible situations arise. Is we try to figure out without God how we can get ourselves out of the situation that does not feel good. I remember, and I've told you before, when I was sick after I came back from Cambodia in 2006, sick for over a year, doctors telling me I might have an infectious disease that they couldn't figure out. I could have cancer, all of these things. Like, it was terrifying for me. And sadly, especially at first, I wrestled with trusting God. I did not run to God and say, God, I trust you. I'm with you in this. To be honest, I took things into my own hands and thought, there's got to be a way to get out of this. I got to find the best doctors, somebody who can tell me what's wrong, somebody who can give me the cure, and my hope was being placed in that. And yet, as every single doctor would come back and tell me over and over again that they had no answers, that they weren't sure what was going on, or that maybe it was cancer and they should remove my spleen, whatever it was, I found myself sinking further and further away from God and finding myself in a more hopeless situation, finding myself often depressed and feeling as though things would never turn out okay. And this is what often happens when we face impossible situations and we take matters into our own hands. What does that look like? It looks like a lack of trust in God, trying to fix the situation on our own, looking to other people to try to help us. And when those things fail us, we find ourselves in overwhelming worry, a feeling of hopelessness, and drawing further and further away from God. Daniel could have easily found himself in this posture as well. But what does it say that he did? Letter C. Instead, Daniel chose to turn to God. It says that Daniel chose to turn to God and to trust in his power and in his plans. Look with me at Daniel chapter 2, verses 14 through 18. We've just read all the way up to the point where the decree has been put out that Daniel is to be killed because he and the others will not be able to interpret or tell this dream. And here's what it says, chapter 2, verse 14. It says, then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree of the king so urgent? And then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel, and Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. And then it says that Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions. And he told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Isn't it interesting that in this great moment of fear for Daniel, where his life is on the line, an impossible situation, Daniel, rather than losing control, freaking out, trying to handle it on his own, or considering that God was not with him and just giving up, instead turns to God and trusts in his power. Look at these three things that those verses in verses 14 through 18 tell us. One, he responded with prudence and discretion. Daniel was controlled. He was controlled as he went to the captain of the guard and talked with him to find out what was going on. His head was level. There was a sense of peace that Daniel must have had as he went to ask what was going on. When we look in verse 16, we see that Daniel showed incredible faith and boldness before he has even been given the dream, let alone interpreting it. Daniel goes to set up a time with the king and say, give me a time where I can sit down with you and tell you what the dream was and interpret it. He goes with great boldness and faith. And then verses 17 through 18, the third thing, it tells us that he turned to God in prayer with absolutely no answers to seek for them. Now this is intriguing to me. I think it's funny when I read it, because if I were to read it the way I would do it, it's like he sets up this appointment, goes back to his friends and is like, guys, we got to pray. We got to hope that God is going to come through for us in this. But no, what Daniel did is he comes through with sheer confidence that as they pray and they seek God, that God is going to answer. I want to ask you this question. Why is it that Daniel is able to respond with such peace, with such calm, with boldness and faith, turning to God in prayer? Roman numeral number 3. Daniel chose to turn to God because of who God was and who he knew God was. Letter A, Daniel believed, and we will see this in the passage, that God was sovereign over all things. This word sovereign means this, write it down. The idea of sovereignty is this. It's the idea of supreme power and supreme authority. Daniel believed and knew that God was in control of all things, that nothing in this life happens without passing through God's hands. And because he believed that God was good and God was for him, he knew that he could trust God even in this impossible situation, because God was in control. And there was no better place for him to be. He believed with all of his heart that God had that authority. And we see it as we read Daniel chapter 2, verses 19 through 23. These verses are often referred to as Daniel's psalm. And it speaks of God's power and his total control over nature, over the nations, and over every living thing. Read with me, if you will, this psalm beginning in verse 19. It says this, that after he has gone to prayer, verse 19, then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in vision of the night. And Daniel blessed the God of heaven, and Daniel answered and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and he sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. What Daniel recognizes and has recognized all along is that God is in control of all things. And in this beautiful psalm, he recognizes that God is the one who causes kings to rise and kings to fall, that he controls all things and that all things are in his hands. Because of that, he can trust God no matter what the impossible situation is. And look what happens. He is given the dream, the passage tells us. And if we were to continue reading it, it would tell us that Daniel goes, he meets with the king. He tells him exactly what his dream was, which Nebuchadnezzar is like, whoa, this is impressive. None of my other religious priests could do this. Not only does he tell it to him, he tells him the interpretation, which basically he says to Nebuchadnezzar, your kingdom will come to an end, and there will be kingdoms that are greater than you that will come after you. And he gives him this interpretation. And what is so impressive to me is that as this takes place, if we were to look all the way back into verse 47 of chapter 2, we would see that because of Daniel's faithfulness and belief in God's sovereignty, Nebuchadnezzar himself acknowledges Daniel's God as a God over all gods. Now, Nebuchadnezzar didn't necessarily become a follower of Yahweh at this point. Most people believe that what Nebuchadnezzar did was go, I've still got all my little gods, but Daniel's God, whoa. He is the one that is over all things, and his eyes are opened up. I want you to see Daniel believed, letter A, that God was sovereign over all things. This is why he was able to respond the way he did. And letter B, Daniel's belief in God's sovereignty impacted his worship of him. I want you to understand this word worship. This isn't just that he gave this psalm of praise to God because God did something for him. When we talk about Daniel's belief in God's sovereignty impacting his worship of him, we're talking about the fact that Daniel lived his life in a way that honored God at all times, even when the situation looked bleak. And that was his act of worship. And we will see this theme of sovereignty, the idea that God is in control of all things, not only here in Daniel chapter 1, Daniel chapter 2, but as we look through the entire book, you will see that this is one grand book where God is revealing himself to Daniel, but he is revealing himself to you and to me as the one who is in control of all things in this world. And because of Daniel's belief and his trust in God's sovereignty, Daniel finds great peace in the midst of his impossible situations. He finds the ability to have confidence in the most bleak of situations, not turning himself to his own devices or to other people, but his confidence is in and his hope is in the Lord, and so he turns there first. We find that Daniel goes out and he responds in great boldness because of the faith that he has in God and the understanding of God's sovereignty. And the passage tells us that Daniel continues to press in closer and closer and closer with God because he knows that God himself is the answer because he controls it all. And there's a lot of things that we can learn from Daniel's life as we consider how he responds in these situations. We've said from the beginning, what you believe to be true about who God is will absolutely impact the way that you worship him. Daniel responded in faith because he knew that God was in control. And we can learn a lot in our own lives when we face impossible situations. We can learn a lot as we consider Daniel's life and we consider how God is in control. Roman numeral number 4, our understanding and belief that God is in control of all things produces these 4 things. Letter A firm foundation for our faith. A very firm foundation for our faith. The very bedrock of the faith that Daniel had was based on the truth that he knew God was in control of all things. And is that the bedrock that is the foundation for our own faith? Is the question that we have to wrestle with. Letter B, because of this, Daniel had confidence to turn to God with all things. And we ourselves need to have the confidence to turn to God in those moments. Having that foundation of faith allows us not to turn to our devices, but to look to God and say, God, I need you. You are the one that can walk me through this. Letter C, when we understand that God is in control, it produces courage in our lives to follow him boldly. And as I was praying even this morning, this psalm came to my heart. Psalm chapter 23. Listen to these words of David, who undoubtedly understood this same exact truth that Daniel did. A psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, For your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. And surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. You see, when you have an understanding that God is all powerful and that he is in control of all things, and you know the fact that he loves you and that he is for you, it gives you the ability to turn your heart and life to him, that no matter how dark the valley is that you are walking through, no matter how impossible the situation is that you are facing, sapping you of joy and sapping you of hope, all you need to do is turn your heart to the God that is in control of all things and recognize that he is for you, and it will give you the courage to say that though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear nothing. For God goes with me. And as we follow God in courage, letter D, we will have a living testimony of God's power and hope for a world that needs him desperately. I wanted to take a moment to share a testimony with you this morning. Oftentimes when we hear people's testimonies of how they've walked through difficult seasons and faced impossible situations, we hear the shiny ending and we think to ourselves, well, they got their answered prayer, but what about me? It sure is easy for you to have faith when things turned out well, but what about me? My friends, are we able to trust God and his sovereignty even when things don't turn out the way we want? Or even when we don't get the miracle that we are praying for? I want to invite somebody a lot of you guys are familiar with to come out and join me. Heidi Hisney, come on out here. Welcome Heidi as she comes, would you? For those of you that don't know Heidi is our assistant to Pastor Adam, and he is our worship pastor, but she has been working here in our worship arts ministries for years and singing and leading us in worship almost on a weekly basis. And Heidi and I got to know each other when I first came about 9 years ago. And as we got to know one another, one of the things that I learned about Heidi is that she has lupus and has been dealing with that for quite some time. And Heidi, would you share with us just a little bit of your story? Maybe share with us when it is that you found out about having lupus. Maybe tell us a little bit about what it is and even what the prognosis is for someone with this.
It is really hard to pinpoint exactly when I got sick. I know it's been at least 15 years that I was having kind of these symptoms. About 10 years ago, I went really looking for answers, and it took a good couple years to get those answers. There were a lot of doctor's appointments and blood work and tests and all sorts of fun stuff. And at the end, I kind of landed at U of M, and they said, you have systemic lupus. And I was like, I have no idea what that is. But it is an autoimmune disease where your immune system attacks healthy tissue. It gets really confused what is good and what is bad in your body. Lupus looks different for every person, but there are some common things that we all have. Joint pain and like an extreme fatigue. I don't even know how to explain it to people. But for me, it has caused migraines. I can't remember the last day that I did not have a headache. Yeah. It affects my lungs. So the area around my lungs gets inflamed, and it is pretty painful to breathe sometimes. And probably the scariest thing for me is it has attacked my kidneys. So eventually I will need dialysis and a transplant. I'm on a ridiculous amount of medication, but yeah.
It's tough, and as we have been friends, I've been with you many times as you've walked through the really difficult and dark parts of this where, especially with the pleurisy and the lungs and not being able to breathe and struggling with that, and many visits to the ER and the hospital, and I've watched the discouragement. Would you share a little bit of just maybe some of the darker moments where it's been tough to trust God and what that's been like?
Lupus is strange because I look fine. And so when I tell somebody I can't do something, I think their view is, well, you don't want to do it. but it literally is I can't. And in my human sense, I tell God that's not fair.
Yeah.
Because at the time that I was diagnosed was also when he was calling me into ministry. And I thought, well, Lord, all these years I was healthy. And I feel like I wasted that. And I feel like now you're calling me to do something and I can't physically do it. It is incredibly hard on relationships. I'm not going to look up there because my husband's up there, but I have a husband that wants to fix and he can't. Frustrating. I have kids that I used to take care of, and now they take care of me. I have friends that have heard no more than they've heard yes. Yeah,
it's tough, and to walk through those moments, undoubtedly there are moments where you look to God and you're like, why?
Yeah.
But one of the things that I've loved is watching as you've walked through this, that often you have turned yourself more into the Lord. And recognize that God is in control. And would you share just a little bit of that journey with us, of trusting God when you don't know the outcome?
Yeah, the valley. It is, I've said, why me? And I think God has answered, why not you? And so I've learned that my faith can't be based on my feelings, because my feelings are affected by my circumstances, and that's going to change. But the things that are not going to change are the things that I know to be true about God, that I know that he has created and designed me. I know that he is the same God that he has always been. The same God that led the Israelites into the promised land is the God that has given every hair on my head a number. He is my joy, and that cannot be taken from me.
Yes, amen.
He is my strength. So when I can't, he will. And he has showed himself faithful. Mornings are ridiculously tough for me. But every time that he calls me, he enables me to do it. And I have learned that there's a purpose. There's a purpose in my suffering. That he has called me to lead his people into worship of him. And I can't lead somebody somewhere that I have not been. And so can I still, in the middle of the fire, say he is the only God worthy? I think that as followers, sometimes we're always looking for the other side of the valley. And we kind of check out. And I would just tell you that if you are in a valley and you're walking through this fire, God is present. Be present with him. Don't wait till the other side to say this is who God is. Who he is the same in the fire as it's going to be on the other side. It's not going to change. He is the God who is so faithful to us. Your story, just like mine, is a story of God's faithfulness. That is what we have to cling to.
Amen. Would you thank Heidi for coming and sharing with us. Church family, what impossible situations are you facing today? What are the things in your life that are robbing you of your own joy and your hope? Maybe you're not walking through something right now that you feel is an impossible situation, but the truth is that you know people that are. Each of us are connected to people that are struggling, whether it be in a marriage situation, the loss of a child, a sickness. The list could go on and on and on. And church family, those friends of yours desperately need to know the God that is in control of all things and the hope that we have in him. The truth is that we live in a fallen world, a world where it is not the way that God designed it to be. And we will face difficult and what seems to be impossible situations. But we need to understand and know the truth that our God has power over all of the impossible situations that we face. And that even as we walk through difficult things, that he walks with us. And he has a purpose and a plan. And that plan and that purpose is not to hurt you, but it is to fulfill his ultimate purposes in your life, the development of your faith for the purposes of eternity. And so my challenge this morning not my challenge. I think the challenge from God's word and from the life of Daniel is to continually remember that the impossible situations that we find ourselves in should not be things that turn us away from God, but that cause us to run more into him because we know that he is in control. And he has proved through his son that he is for you. He loves you. Will you trust him in the middle of those impossible situations? Would you pray with me? Oh God, this morning as we worshiped, Lord, we sang songs to you that speak of your greatness and that speak of your majesty. We sang songs about how the heavens declare your glory. And Lord, as we study your word and as we go through this book of Daniel, we see that you are revealing yourself to Daniel, but also revealing yourself to an evil king, and you are revealing yourself to all of us in this room, that you are a God that is in control of every single thing. There is nothing in this life we understand, God, that happens without passing through your hands. And while we may not always understand the difficult situations that we face, things that seem impossible and that could easily sap us of our joy and our trust, Heavenly Father, I pray that you would help us to cling to that truth that we've been talking about, that what we believe to be true about you will impact the way that we worship you. It will change the way that we live our lives. And so, God, may you help us to understand to an even greater degree the truth of your sovereignty, of how you control all things, coupled with the fact that you deeply love us. And you've proven it in the way that you have pursued us through your Son, Jesus Christ. And so, Father, whatever it is that we are walking through today, whatever it is that we are struggling with to trust you, I pray, God, that you would come around each and every single one of us, that you would wrap us in your arms, that we would understand, God, that you are in control. Give us the faith, God, to trust. Give us the strength to walk, that your name would be made great as we trust you and we follow you. We pray these things in Jesus' name.